The grass alongside the highway streaked by after Ludmilla was blasted back by the Beastman Lord's attack. Her world was a haze of blinding pain before she distanced herself from the sensations of her body. Even with invulnerable fortress, her arms were shattered from her wrists to her elbows and her shoulders were dislocated. The shaft of her glaive, which had been held out crosswise in a desperate attempt to block her foe's attack, had been forced into her breastplate and her ribs were crushed. Her head wobbled loosely as her body tumbled through the air. Had Ludmilla still been one of the living, being knocked unconscious would have been a mercy. Even if landing wherever she was going didn't kill her, she would have been able to do nothing but lie there and wait for death. As she was now, however, it was simply damage. Pain was something that was happening elsewhere. Her shattered arms would become strong enough to use again and her pulverized organs, though they did little in this situation beyond act as mass, would similarly recover. The human instincts and emotions that remained a part of her being could be ignored, but just smothering them was foolish. Instead, she partitioned away her shock and confusion. Then, she grasped what lay at the core of her identity, the adamantine will to fight and defeat her foes. Ludmilla's trajectory took her into a nearby copse of trees. Her body folded around a tree trunk and her spine snapped. She fell from there, flopping off of the branches on the way down until entering the poorly maintained tangle of undergrowth with the sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs. She lay on the ground for a moment, all too aware of her destroyed organs pulsing feebly beneath her crushed ribs. After the moment passed, she concealed herself and sat up. When nothing immediately pounced upon her, she took a quick inventory of herself and her surroundings. Her armor had already repaired itself and her arms were already stable enough to reach out for and lift her glaive. There was no visible sign of damage on the weapon, though it would have similarly fixed itself as magical equipment did. The sounds of battle still came from outside the copse, though they were rapidly receding. She rose to her feet, alert for any signs of pursuit as she relocated to the edge of the trees. Across the ditch, Death Series servitors ran alongside beastmen while other beastmen attacked them from behind. It was a scene that she had witnessed many times before, though that scene involved adventurers in the adventurer training area rather than beastmen running down a highway in the Draconic Kingdom. I was so happy that I broke the effect and they just went and reapplied it. Turn Undead allowed a cleric to impose a state of divine fear or awe into the undead by channeling positive energy, or negative energy, depending on what they were doing, which could result in a variety of effects. Goodly clerics could make the undead run away or even outright destroy them. Evil clerics like Lady Shiltia could also force the undead to cower where they were, reinforce friendly undead against turning or even take control of enemy undead. One could often turn undead beings that were significantly stronger than themselves and the ability could be used several times a day. The problem was the sheer magnitude of the effect on display before her. As far as she knew, the only answer was that the clerics that had performed the turning were undead specialists with something that amplified turning. Rolengork was so vast that she couldn't discount the idea that they had undead of their own to deal with, especially along the desert on its southern border. An undead horde appearing in the Draconic Kingdom would naturally have the tribal confederation call on any experts to help. The wide array of new tactics that were effective against the undead were probably put into effect not long after they arrived. Anti-undead martial arts may also have been used against her, though she felt no lingering effects that might follow them. Her fingers squeezed tightly on her weapon as she resisted the urge to run out and assist her struggling soldiers. She needed to know what was going on, first. Psycho, where are you? Roughly 1,500 meters above our defensive line. Is it even a line anymore? Observed behavior suggests that turn undead has been employed, but the effect is disproportionately large compared to any models created for the appearance of beastmen clergy. That was more than a bit of an understatement. Since the beastmen worshipped gods, they should have had the accompanying clergy, but every beastman mystic they observed was indistinguishable from a druid. Once they started fighting the warrior clans and a discernible priesthood still didn't appear, Ludmilla was of the mind that their society hadn't developed to the point where their temples became an organized institution that started producing clerics, priests and other associated vocations. Maybe they had been kept in reserve for a situation just like the one they were in. In a catastrophic turn of events, they conducted a counteroffensive aimed at the head of the undead forces. Or at least it would have been if it were a conventional army where the general's tent would be on the hill where Queen Auricula's currently was. What are the beastmen doing? As far as I could tell when they hit my position, They were trying to break straight through us. That still appears to be the case. Observations indicate that the Beastman offensive has split into 3 parts. 2 are attempting to encircle the hill. 1 is traveling straight towards Queen Auricula's designated position. Have reconnaissance begin delivering reports to Lord Tian on the Beastman movements around his position. Acknowledged. Ludmilla backed up into the copse a bit, eyeing the hill in the west through the trees. Lord Tian, I'm not sure how much of this you can see from where you are, but the Beastmen are attempting to encircle your position. The fastest and most numerous group should be coming up the highway, but the Rangers can make it through the fields just as quickly and may try to ambush you. There are probably around 30,000 of them. The General Staff said that leaving matters in Lord Tian's hand would be sufficient in any case, but she still wondered what the royal butler would resort to. As far as she could tell, he was the sort that would only retaliate after others attacked or if they insulted His Majesty somehow. If it were her, she would just take Queen Auricula's and leave, but she doubted that the royal court would accept one of the Sorceress Kingdom's representatives being driven away like that. Psycho, how is Olga doing? The Beastmen are still resisting her at their first defensive line, but they are visibly weakening. The General Staff predicts a decisive breakthrough within the next hour. Heavy footfalls alerted Ludmilla to an approaching set of Na. The 2 lords that she had confronted were among their number. Ludmilla retreated further into the copse. There's no sign of it. Another Na materialized in front of the group upon speaking. Ludmilla narrowed her eyes and peered at her surroundings. She hadn't noticed her presence at all. I don't see how that could be unless she has the ability to cover her tracks, the new arrival said. Her remains probably disintegrated. No, I didn't see any of her equipment on the ground. I don't disagree, but that would defy everything we know about the undead. Didn't you say she was an undead lord or commander or something along those lines? A scout commander? That monkey dropped out of the sky, another Na said. Maybe she was a spectral type. Was shiny enough to be one. Like that makes our job any easier. The first Na turned away from the group, but Ludmilla couldn't tell what sort of expression she was wearing. The Beastman re-entered the trees, not making a sound while seemingly phasing through the high grass and unkempt bushes. Ludmilla didn't stick around to see how close she could get without being detected. She had no right to complain, but only listening to part of an important conversation was a bit frustrating. The Na was probably a ranger reporting to her lord, and the lord was exclusively using the voice of authority to communicate. This in itself might have seemed odd since many of Roland Gork's lords shouted their orders over the battlefield, but she had to consider that it may have just been a biased observation since they wouldn't hear the voice of authority being used when it was. The ability was a pseudo-secret everywhere she went, and it was veiled in an esoteric shroud by its users. She had to assume that it was the same everywhere, especially considering the tremendous advantages it conferred. Going by the casual feeling of the conversation, they were a powerful tribal group rather than members of a strict military hierarchy. Their equipment, too, appeared to be nothing if not mundane. The coats of green dragon scale sported by the others in the counter-offensive were far more impressive at a glance. This suggested that they were in reality 2 different groups, one with jungle territory that attracted green dragons and the other bordering an undead-infested area, which would obviously have none. With no visual cues to work with and no appraisal ability, trying to guess at their equipment quality was a futile venture. All that she knew was that they were looking for her, meaning that the opening attack by the Beastman Lord wasn't some random act. The Beastmen saw the defeat of enemy lords as a mark of high prestige, and while she had used the fact that she was a lord against them in the past, it was now very much working against her. Or not. As long as they're convinced that I'm still around, they won't join the others. The group that was hunting for her was far stronger than the rest of the Beastmen combined. Not only was every single one of them stronger than she was, but the 2 lords were beyond her ability to gauge. That probably made them as strong or stronger than the Viridian Dragon Lord. The only saving grace she could think of was that they didn't fly. How did the intelligence division fail to find out about them using the Beastmen delivered for questioning? Then again, Roland Gork was huge. Its warrior clans were seen as ubiquitously strong and their lords stronger still. There was no way to know for sure how strong one lord was relative to another unless they were compared directly. Like us, they seem to be stuck in a bubble of their own. The theocracy is to blame for at least part of it, too. Ludmilla disabled her trackless step and her boots squished into the mud. She wandered across the copse and re-enabled it about a third of the way through. Hopefully, that would keep them scratching their heads while she figured out how to strike back. First, she needed to rally her scattered troops. After that, she would make herself as obnoxious to kill as possible. Despite the perilous situation, the beastmen were still on their way to losing Eastwatch. She reached the opposite side of the copse and looked around. Death Series servitors fleeing at full speed could run very far. She could only make out a few in the distance. She entered a ditch alongside one of the rural roads leading away from the copse, running half-bent in an effort to stay out of sight. A few minutes later, the sound of battle carried over the wind. Ludmilla took a quick peek to see where it was coming from. A few hundred meters away, to the side of the nearby village, an Our warband was fighting a Death Knight. They were neatly organized into several layers, with their mystics lending support from a distance. The Death Knight attacks were focused on the Lord opposing it while the other combatants took turns chipping away at its defenses. Ludmilla snuck through the buildings of the village to the other side of the warband, hoping that whatever she did wouldn't draw the attention of the stupidly powerful beastmen searching the copse a kilometer away. "Got another one of those damn spikes off," one of the Now warriors said. "Get that part covering its thigh." Another pointed a claw. "I'm not sure who's being tortured more," the Lord grumbled. "This Death Knight, or me?" The glow of healing magic washed over the Lord, closing a few bleeding gashes on his arms. They were winning against the Death Knight, but they were winning very slowly. She pondered how she could best destabilize the fight. Every member of the warband appeared to be at least difficulty rating 45, which was equivalent in raw power to a platinum rank adventurer. The Lord was around difficulty rating 75, which was just under adamantite. Their mystics were fresh-looking and eager, which meant mana exhaustion wasn't setting in. Eliminating the mystics would rapidly make things take a turn for the worse as far as the beastmen were concerned, but she would probably only be able to kill a few before she was swarmed. Her bow was mundane and she didn't have strong ranged martial arts, but envenomed arrows might do the trick. Having Psycho summon something to disrupt the proceedings was also an option, but it would take a lot of mana. A furious howl filled the air as the Death Knight used its area of effect taunt. Wounds built up on the Lord before he realized what was going on and broke his mystics out of the taunt. Ludmilla narrowed her eyes at yet another display of the ability she didn't have. Or did she? Not long before, she had broken her squads out of a turn undead effect without ever thinking at any point that she could do it or that she even needed it. The only thing on her mind was that she couldn't let it happen and she literally willed it not to. With the recent experience to refer to, she drew upon the wellspring of will deep within herself. Wake up. It wasn't the best choice of words, but it probably didn't matter. The Death Knight looked in her direction. Ack. Don't look this way. The Death Knight looked away. Ludmilla frowned. Wait, you're free? Stab one of the beastmen between you and me. Arg. Hey, what the? Shouts of alarm and confusion rose as the Death Knight slashed at the surrounding beastmen. More than a few sent looks at the Lord. The Lord roared out in challenge, striking at the Death Knight. The Death Knight ignored him and continued to attack the weaker beastmen around it. I'm an idiot. It was, in effect, the same thing that she had done with Amelia over a year ago. In Ludmilla's quest for improvement, everything had become framed in terms of knowns. Job classes. Skills. Abilities. Martial arts. She went to great lengths to study and define things, but that approach was probably wrong. As the executor of her powers, being bound by rigid definition was foolish because she was the one who fluidly defined the manifestation of those powers for every single use. Reality had little bearing on feats that defied reality. Lady Shiltier had advised her several times to that effect, yet that advice had somehow gone in one ear and out the other, or at least didn't make a meaningful impression. Break through and hit the healers in the outer ring. The Death Knight worked its way through the surrounding warriors, cutting down some while sending others flying with its tower shield. In the back, the mystics continued healing for several moments before realizing that they were the ones being targeted. Several raised their paws toward the charging undead servitor. Entangle. Trampled grass came to life, rapidly growing to reach up and twine around the Death Knight. Complaints rose as every warrior within 12 meters was caught up in the spell as well. Ludmilla dashed out from the shadows of the village and onto the field, cutting down the nearest mystic from behind. She went through 3 more before the warband's members noticed what was going on. A human? A human lord. What's a human lord doing here? A few of the beastmen turned to aid their mystics, but most were ensnared by the multiple entangle spells layered around the Death Knight. Several squire zombies rose from the slain, adding to the growing chaos. Ludmilla decapitated another mystic before turning to deflect the strike of the first warrior to reach her. Her riposte took off the warrior's arm and a blossoming iris knocked it back into another warrior coming their way. Have you gone mad, human? The Lord roared. The undead infest the countryside and you insist on fighting the living. Ludmilla opened the next mystic from crotch to shoulder, then flicked the blood off of her blade. Several bullets bounced off of her armor's shielding enchantment. Damn it, someone stop her. The next few mystics in line fled, moving to place the entangled melee between Ludmilla and themselves. She turned and dealt with the next few warriors closing with her. Once they were dispatched, she charged straight for the melee. Her silvery glaive flashed in the sunlight as made her way towards the Death Knight. She found it with the Beastman Lord, who was also being assailed by a trio of squire zombies. Are humans truly so foolish? He grated. KHHSCHLR was right, you will stop at nothing to see us destroyed. I have no idea why you think there would be a human in the middle of all this, Ludmilla replied. After the Beastman Lord was dispatched, the Death Knight's area of effect taunt took hold of the warband and the battle became a long string of executions. Ludmilla examined the surrounding area while that happened. Nothing appeared to be coming from the nearby copse, but that warband's scouts were powerful enough that Ludmilla wouldn't see them coming until it was too late. The beastmen heading for Queen Auricula's position were nearly at the base of the hill. She spotted another warband northwest of the village, presumably fighting another Death Series servitor. From the look of things, the beastmen advancing on the hill had left behind warbands to occupy the undead scattered about. We can't afford to keep pace with the zombies, but we should still use them for something. Send them to attack the warband to the northeast while we go northwest. The squire zombies shuffled off with their zombies. Ludmilla and the Death Knight headed their own way. She gauged the Death Knight's condition en route, nodding at what she saw. Similar to the way adventurers did things, the Beastman's method of dealing with the Death Knights involved a suitably proficient warrior focusing on defense while occupying a Death Knight's attention. As such, the warrior relied on the other members of their party to deal damage. This worked well when they were drawn into the high concentration of beastmen around Eastwatch, as there would be plenty of decently powerful attackers on hand. However, a warband tended to have one strong lord leading a group of regular warriors. In the time that the Death Knight she had rescued had probably been engaged in combat, it had only taken about 5% of its health in damage. The next warband they came upon was partially prepared for their arrival. Having a Death Knight rapidly stomping their way was likely hard to miss. Without another strong individual to stop them, however, they simply smashed through the preparations, or, rather, Ludmilla's freedom effect allowed her to ignore their measures against the Death Knight, and things rapidly devolved into a brawl. 10 minutes later, she had 2 Death Knights following her lead. As I thought, the beastmen are much easier to deal with when they're operating as warbands. Only when they were allowed to gather in sufficient numbers did they have the force to resist entire squads of Death Series servitors. Their move to encircle Eastwatch effectively forced that condition. The question now was whether the General Staff had done so on purpose to create a tangible challenge for the Royal Army and collect the data that they desired. Their motive would be obscured to the forces on the field, Ludmilla included, to keep things genuine. After sending the raised zombies to the same warband as the other zombies, Ludmilla and the 2 Death Knights continued northwest. The next warband was gathered at the village further up the road. Instead of charging with her subordinates as she had with the previous group, she sent the Death Knights wide to perform a pincer attack and waited to see how they did. If things went well, they could split into separate groups and gather their forces more quickly. Once she witnessed the result, she called her 3 Death Knights together. All right, it looks like we can split up into pairs to rally the rest of our troops out here. You 2 head southeast while I'll head west. Any idea if anything other than Death Knights survived? The Death Knights shook their heads. I see. In that case, I'll have Psycho coordinate things from above for now. Remember to split off new pairs to reach more of your comrades as you're able to. She sent the new pair of Death Knights on their way before relaying her instructions to Psycho. The next 15 minutes saw their numbers quadruple. With things well on the road to recovery, Such that it was, Ludmilla's thoughts returned to the problem of the powerful Nar warband. From what she had seen, they were strong enough to require at least 10 infantry squads to get rid of. If she had things her way, she would have brought 30 just to be sure. Psycho, any sign of that powerful warband? None. Rallying the troops, I see, a voice came from behind her. What a diligent captain you are. Ludmilla turned to find the Nar Lord that had sent her flying coming around the buildings on the other side of the village. How had reconnaissance failed to detect his approach? Might I ask you and your tribe to leave the Draconic Kingdom? Ludmilla said, it is not your land, after all. I'm afraid not, the Nar Lord said. There can only be one answer when it comes to the undead. We will destroy you and every undead creature left in your wake. The negative energy wasteland that you spawned from will be purged and cleansed. Is that truly warranted? She supposed that, for the vast majority of the living population, it was the proper answer. The undead were universally reviled and the living granted them no quarter because they were the antithesis of life. More Nar appeared all around them. The Nar Lord unsheathed his claws and pounced. This time, instead of invulnerable fortress, Ludmilla used Windstride to swiftly retreat before her foe's assault. She leapt onto a house and off of the other side into the fields. The Nar Lord gave pursuit, swatting the Death Knight accompanying her to the side when it tried stepping in his path. A bullet flew in and glanced across her temple, revealing a hunter shadowing her flight to the left. Another bullet came in from the right and was caught by her skirts. The hunter that had sent the projectile her way seemed surprised at the result. Ahead of her, the two Nar Lords seemed unimpeded by the mud. Neither were the warriors accompanying them. I need to delay. She activated her hairpin and lifted off at the ground. Another bullet whistled in and struck her on the shoulder and she landed back on the field. Ludmilla's gauntleted hand went up to the ornament as she tried to activate it again, but nothing happened. That hunter disabled my flight magic? A martial art? A skill? It didn't really matter. Her only easy avenue of escape had been summarily denied. To either side, the hunters overtook her and kept going. The two lords continued to shadow her. She needed to break out of the enclosure before they shut the trap. Ludmilla changed direction, going perpendicular to her previous course. As expected, more hunters appeared from concealment, moving to block her path. She ran straight ahead, knocking the Nar directly in front of her away with a blossoming iris and following in its trail. She made it all of 6 meters before the Nar Lord materialized directly to her front. His wickedly curved claws were the last thing Ludmilla saw before oblivion took her. Mistress. Elishnish bolted upright from her litter, eyes wide with shock. At the same time, an indescribably horrible sense of wrongness suffused her entire being. Something beyond loss. Her anxiety rose 100-fold. It almost felt as if the world itself was shrieking alongside Elishnish in the emptiness left in the ruins of her broken telepathic bond. I need to do something. I need to go. I need to. She took 2 steps before tripping on something and landing on her snout. Rude, Vltava said. The shape of the Chronos Druid resolved itself in her frantic senses. Elishnish pushed herself back up to her feet. How can you be so calm? Elishnish cried, can't you feel it? The warden is, she's. It happens, Vltava told her. Huh? It happens, Pinecone said. It happens, Pebble mumbled through the tail in her mouth. It happens? Elishnish whispered weakly. The sounds of the jungle drifted in from the entrance of their stone den and Shork's clan hold as the 3 Chronos silently stared at her. How could they be so nonchalant? They made it sound as if they were remarking on the weather. Dame Verilyn. Hi. Kya ah. Pebble and Pinecone jumped. Vltava gave her an odd look. Had she screamed out loud, as well? She probably did. It took a moment for her frazzled mind to realize that she was being magically contacted. Miss Gran? Why would you just shout into someone's head like that? I'm sorry. No, forget that, this is horrible. I don't know how I know, but something's gone terribly wrong. Baroness Saradnik, she. It happens. I beg your pardon? Elishnish glanced around the den. 3 out of 4 people say so. Huh? Now that I think about it, the citizens in Warden's Vale mentioned that. Some of the adventurers did, too. Haven't you seen the billboard in the village square? So and so days since last incident. This is the incident. I thought it was like those accident-free signs that the Imperial Ministry of Magic puts up in their laboratories. Well, now you know. Still, that feeling, I won't be able to do any work like this. If you don't feel like working, then perhaps you shouldn't. Really? That doesn't sound like something you should say as a liege. It isn't as if I'm one of you productivity-obsessed humans. Aren't you always talking about how you look forward to receiving your taxes? It's just a byproduct of you people trying to convert everything that you can into coins in the first place, so the taxes aren't going anywhere if you need some time for yourself. Also, I think your perception of dragons is a bit off. Having a horde is nice and all, but the balance of our domains comes first and foremost. One day, she would find whoever made up all those silly stories about dragons and have a stern word with them. It was already bad enough that dragons were seen as bundles of crafting materials. Possesses stupendous hordes of treasure being cultivated as a default expectation just felt plain malicious. Home invaders that assaulted poor dragons probably even had the gall to be angry about the fact that their victims didn't have much in the way of valuables. In that case, I'm going back to bed. I haven't had a day to myself since we arrived in the Sorceress Kingdom. Thanks, Dame Verilyn. The message ended. Elishnish looked to the three Kronos. So, it happens? She said. It happens, Voltava replied. She hoped they were right. Frost dragons didn't experience second-hand knowledge. They couldn't know something until they experienced it. It wasn't a problem for most, as they happily dwelled in their domains for their entire existence, but Elishnish lived a markedly different life. Nemel probably has the right idea. Elishnish went back to her litter and settled comfortably upon it. For dragons, sleep was a reliable recourse for passing time. Hopefully, by the time she woke, everything would be back to normal. Now then, how shall we go about this? Sabos stroked his beard as he digested the latest reconnaissance reports from the Royal Army. From the shadows of the nearby cedar tree, Queen Auriculus cast her gaze over the countryside with a tiny frown. He offered her a reassuring smile. "Worry not, Your Majesty," he said. "The matter of your security is still well in hand." Rather than displaying relief, the Queen's troubled expression only deepened. It was a look that waxed and waned in intensity since they departed for Ligia for Rorikalon, and she remained closed on the subject. One thing was certain, however. Whatever weighed upon her small shoulders overrode mortal peril, even with 40,000 beastmen making their way toward her. He turned his attention back to the landscape below. Roughly a kilometer away, the central thrust of the beastman counteroffensive was entering the small forest at the base of the hill. The entire area around the hill was commonly known as a Kingswood or Royal Forest. One of many locations in a country where hunting and foraging were reserved for the provision of the crown and its guests, as she held court around the country. The territories reserved tended to be rugged areas that were ill-suited for agriculture, and local rangers were assigned to manage them. Those rangers were long gone, however, and the forest was quickly filling with foes. Baroness Saradnik had chosen the location not only because it offered advantage of the area around Eastwatch, but also because there would be ample opportunity to flee with the Queen if necessary. She had recommended exactly that should things take an unexpected and undesirable turn. Sabos, however, had been issued another set of instructions from the royal court. The diplomatic mission to the Draconic Kingdom was originally planned to be an exercise in what Pandora's actor termed soft power, and Countess Corlin's delegation operated explicitly within those lines. The Royal Army had been deployed with a different set of objectives, namely dealing with the unexpected beastman occupation. Sabos was often considered a member of the diplomatic delegation, but he had been dispatched as and continued to be a bodyguard from the royal household of the Sorceress Kingdom assigned to Queen Auriculus. Any doubt cast upon his capabilities cast doubt upon the capabilities of his master's household. As such, none of his actions as a bodyguard could be construed in ways that undermined his charge's confidence in his capabilities. Fleeing before the very beastmen he was sent to guard Queen Auriculus against was, of course, out of the question. Unfortunately, he had no way to efficiently get rid of so many beastmen in such a wide area. Furthermore, he couldn't leave Queen Auriculus' side. Shiltir had dispatched over 10,000 Quago and Theoburkana, but Aura had trapped them in a painted facsimile of the city using depiction of nature and society. Shiltir's polearm also gave her much better reach than Sabos, and she could perform wide, cleaving attacks with it. He could uproot the straightest tree he could find to swat the beastmen with, but he wasn't sure whether a tree counted as a quarterstaff, and monks were not proficient at wielding weapons in the tree category. The notion in itself felt crass, and the tree would likely break apart anyway. Snarls issued from the woods down the eastern slope. They were getting close. It seemed that he would simply have to dispatch them one at a time. Sabos tightened his left glove, then his right. The first beastman appeared, a lord of the Gnar variety. Countless others streamed out of the forest and onto the bald hilltop. Several smooth stones whistled through the air at Sabos. His hand moved to intercept each in turn. The lead beastman narrowed his eyes at him. "Hol, Thurgok. Go around and get that female. I'll deal with this one." Two Gnar behind the leader immediately split away to either side. Several hundred others went with them. Sabos' feet shifted as he turned to intercept the one heading to his left. "Oh no, you don't." The Gnar lord roared and pounced. A paw as wide as Sabos' chest came in, its gleaming claws wreathed in fiery light. Crimson Tiger Claw. The Gnar lord used his momentum to perform an attack that raked across Sabos' back from shoulder to waist. Sabos planted his right foot on the ground, exploding forward to his target. He closed the distance in an instant. His left fist caught the leading beastman squarely in the chest, then he went on to hit the 23 next closest targets. A fine mist tinged the clear afternoon sky with a bloody hue. Sabos reversed direction, splattering 24 more beastmen over the stones of the hilltop before stopping beside Queen Auriculus to intercept 8 bullets aimed at her. He flicked one back with each hand, killing 2 beastmen with slings standing at the tree line. More so than the warriors, the hunters were limiting his movements with their attempts to snipe the queen. "Shadow demons," he said. "Deal with the enemy rangers." 6 blotches of darkness separated from his shadow, sliding along the ground toward the trees. Sabos stopped 12 more bullets before the Gnar lord finally caught up to him. The beastman assailed him with a barrage of slashes, but Sabos ignored him as he alternated between killing the flanking beastmen and stopping the bullets still flying at the queen. A different beastman lord threw itself at him bodily. "Restrain his movements," he shouted, "he has to go down eventually." 4 beastmen latched onto Sabos as he continued to block bullets, followed by 3 more. He frowned at one who had its jaws clamped around his forearm, its saliva running over the sleeve of his coat. "Humph." Sabos squeezed his fist, flexing his forearm. The beastman's head exploded. He grabbed the others trying to hold him down and hurled them into the warbands closing in. Shouts filled the air as they crashed into their fellows, pulping everyone they came into contact with. Still, the beastman came. He jumped up and swept out a leg, removing the heads of 5 attempting to encircle him with a flying roundhouse kick. He landed and dashed between 2 of the beastmen to annihilate the ones crowding behind, returning to the queen's side before the first 5 bodies collapsed to the ground. In the corner of his eye, he saw the other group heading for the queen drawing close. More claws raked at his arms, legs, and back as he turned to address the threat. Roll dod. The front half of the flanking group was rendered into a shower of gore. The back half only started to widen their eyes in shock before they joined them. Sabos returned to the tree with the queen, zipping by the center force still doggedly trying to stop him. In their eyes were neither fear nor grief, only frenzied determination that intensified with every heartbeat. He laid low another line of beastmen before observing their reactions in the lull of his movements. They now all appeared to be focused on him. "Destroy that vile monster." A furious roar issued from the First Lord. "Our homes and families are doomed if we do not." Sabos met their determined gazes. His beard shifted as his lips formed into a thin line. Was that how they saw things? He reappeared at the queen's side. She issued a squeak as he picked her up and dashed south, kicking apart the warbands that were emerging from the worn cliffs along the riverbank. Snarls filled the air as he used beastman heads as stepping stones on the way down, but Sabos disregarded them as he confronted his thoughts. In Rhea's eyes, who was good and who was evil were as plain as day. The unjust acted with open irreverence toward any notion of goodness, while the righteous were punished for daring to oppose any wrongdoing. To Sabos, the choices that he made there were a matter of course, and he was fully willing to accept the consequences of his actions. The Draconic Kingdom, however, was nothing like Rhea's ties. He couldn't say that everyone was good, but it was a good country despite all of its troubles. The bonds between the people were strong, be they aristocrats, commoners or anything else. When trouble came, They banded together and fought. Then they banded together to rebuild their lives and continue on. It wasn't a place like Riestais where parents would sell their children into slavery and people turned their backs on one another without a second thought. Even those that ended up as slaves in the Draconic Kingdom out of necessity were protected by the very organizations that would abuse them elsewhere. In all, it was a place where people did what was right. Sabos was both pleased and proud to be of assistance to them. That being said, the Beastman clans that were their nemesis were surprisingly not as evil or cruel as their relationship with the Draconic Kingdom suggested. They simply were what they were, and there was a distinct nobility to the character of the warriors he fought now. From their perspective, they weren't ruthless invaders being driven out of their ill-gotten gains by the forces of righteousness. Instead, an unspeakably evil threat had appeared and they were the champions who had risen to the occasion. He alighted at the base of the cliff amidst a throng of growling gnaw. After getting his bearings, he dashed straight for the river. Trees and bushes were painted red as he kicked his way through the grasping claws of thousands of beastmen. According to Queen Auricula's, the invasion and follow-up occupation were both unprecedented and uncharacteristic. The use of Lera was an utter shock. As far as their history was concerned, the Draconic Kingdom and its beastmen neighbors shared a relationship that was not unlike that of many countries elsewhere. Humans, as weak as they were, more often than not ended up being prey for non-human powers that saw no benefit to more cooperative arrangements. She did not begrudge them for their current circumstances. At first, Sabos thought it odd, but he thought he was starting to understand why she felt that way and how her people could conduct themselves as they did. The world had its rules. There were rules for the weak and rules for the strong. The Draconic Kingdom was not strong, so Queen Auricula's played by the rules of the weak. With nowhere to run and nowhere to hide and a nominal suzerain that disallowed them from forging alliances with their neighbors, all they could do was improve, slowly becoming better and better while they endured the cycles of predation visited upon them. Even if they were invaded and their land occupied, they would continue doing so. At some point, it would become undeniable that it was a waste to treat them as food. With that approach, harboring hate and resentment were counterproductive, blinding one to opportunities for positive change. Adopting the attitudes of the humans in Riestais and the Empire would be similarly fruitless, as they seemed irreconcilable with other societies too far removed from theirs. It might have taken generations or even centuries, but the people of the Draconic Kingdom could find their place in the world through almost any circumstance. Now, it appeared that Queen Auricula's grand strategy was about to pay off beyond her wildest expectations. Sabos arrived at the highway along the riverbank and looked down at Queen Auricula's. Cradled in his arms, she was so red that he at first thought her covered in blood from the thousands of beastmen he had slain along the way. "Is your Majesty all right?" he asked. "I'm all right." Her small figure seemed to shrink even further. "What about you? They hit you so many times." "I am unharmed, Your Majesty," Sabos replied. "Thank you for your kind concern." Aside from being soiled by their attempts to bite him, Sabos' equipment was unaffected by the beastmen's attacks. It would have probably been a different story if he were a human, but he had enough damage reduction to negate their offense. Beastmen started to appear out of the forest along the highway, their slings of braided rope in paw. Considering the movement penalties imposed on individuals in wooded terrain, they were likely all rangers. Several fell to the ground as razor-sharp claws reached out from their shadows to hamstring them. The shadow demons were still carrying out his orders. "What's going on with them?" Queen Auricula's asked. "I had some allies interfere with their rangers to reduce the number of ranged attacks made against Your Majesty," Sabos answered. They could only deal with so many at a time, however. Soon, hundreds of beastmen were swarming out of the forest, then thousands. Sabos Summer. The General Staff predicts that the beastmen will combine their forces in an attempt to defeat you through the use of overwhelming numbers. Is there any danger to Queen Auricula's? We have not noted the approach of any flanking forces. The handling of the Queen has been left to your discretion. In all honesty, he was far from the best choice for VIP protection duties. Out of Nazarik's most powerful NPCs, Aura would likely surpass Albedo if the form of that protection came in wide area security, but one could hardly have her magical beasts running all over the place. Albedo was by far the go-to option when it came to direct personal protection, but she was the Prime Minister of the Sorceress Kingdom. That aside, Sabos believed that there was a 50-50 chance of Albedo and Queen Auriculus either getting along famously or Albedo strangling the person that she was supposed to protect. Their ideological approaches to statecraft were so different that they could be perfectly complementary, or those same differences could set them at odds with one another. There he is. Eventually, a beastman came out of the forest close enough to spot them. The entire army responded to the alert, moving as one up the highway towards their position. Sabos shook himself free of his wandering thoughts. Regardless of his feelings on the matter, he had a duty to perform. He existed to serve the supreme beings and their cause. All else was insignificant by comparison. He considered his options. They were now on much better terrain to fight on, and they were all approaching from a single direction, making it easier to keep the queen safe while he fought. There must be a better way to do this. Monks had a wide range of key abilities, but the vast majority augmented their existing physical fighting ability in some way. Since even a finger flick was enough to kill most of the beastmen coming his way, any such augmentation was superfluous. Monks were, by and large, focused rapid attackers, and even ranged skills such as Ki Blast only affected one target. It seemed that his best option was simply punching over 35,000 beastmen once each. Sabos? Queen Auriculus said, if you'd like to free up your hands, you can put me down. In fact, I'm not sure how much longer I can bear this, so please put me down. Was he causing her discomfort? Sabos chided himself over his lack of awareness as a butler. He looked over his shoulder to the barge moored a few hundred meters away. The briefing before the battle indicated that even the strongest individuals were in the low to mid-30s level-wise. If he placed the Queen Belodex and assigned all 6 shadow demons to guard her, it was highly unlikely any beastmen would come close enough to present a physical threat. I beg your forgiveness, Your Majesty, Sabos said. In that case, shall I bring you to the ship? The Queen nodded, and Sabos made his way southwest along the highway. He alighted on the deck of the barge a minute later and looked back the way he had come. The beastman army continued to pursue him, forming a long column on the road. What was it that Countess Corlin mentioned again? He rocked back and forth experimentally, feeling the ship respond to his movements. Sabos? He turned and planted his feet on the deck. Hup. Sabos dashed in the opposite direction of the beastmen. The barge flew down the highway, smashing into the beastman column. It continued skidding along, greased by the strip of pulverized flesh it left in its wake. Mouth aghast, Queen Auriculus stared at the carnage with wide eyes. That's, UA. The Queen leaned out and retched, leaving a trail of vomit in the air as she and Sabos upped over the Oraculon. Over on the highway, the barge came to a stop, but not before it had combined 90% of the beastman column with the pavement. A fireball exploded amongst the remaining beastmen as the barge's undead crew boiled out to defend their vessel like angry wasps from a kicked nest. They were quickly joined by the shadow demons and several of the royal army's elder liches, who had been observing from high above. Once Sabos landed on the opposite shore of the river, he set Queen Auriculus down. She immediately turned away from him, raising a hand to wipe her mouth. My apologies for any discomfort Your Majesty may have experienced, Sabos said. He produced a trooper's towel from his inventory and held it out at the Queen's elbow, then offered a flask of water. Several minutes later she finished washing out her mouth and fixing her appearance. I had no idea you were so strong, Queen Auriculus said. When you were fighting on the hill, it looked like there were 10 of you. Are you from a draconic line, as well? Or perhaps... She closed her mouth and swallowed, tentatively looking up at him. Sabos retrieved his things and put them away. I am but a humble butler, Your Majesty. If you are a humble butler, the Queen snorted, then we would like access to the Sorcerer's Kingdom's job market. If the Sorcerer King's entire household is anything like you, then all of the enemies in the world would be a laughable matter. Queen Auriculus offered him a tired smile, but she seemed to sense that it was an awkward question and did not press him any further. So, she said, now that our little adventure has concluded, how goes the battle for Eastwatch? I will convey Your Majesty's query during the Royal Army's next report, Sabos replied. Shall we return to our vantage? That hill? The Queen's expression shifted behind her sovereign's mask. Considering the state they must have left it in, it was a thoughtless proposal. Sabos Summer. Sabos raised a hand to his ear. Yes, what is it? The General Staff has a request. Captain Zaradnik has been slain in battle. They would like you to recover her remains. What of her slayers? Unknown. Unknown? None of the servitors with her survived. Reconnaissance assets are being destroyed before they can come close enough for visual identification. What about divination? All attempts at divination turn up nothing at the location. We suspect that the individuals in question have the benefit of a non-detection effect or something similar. While some of Nazarik's agents used a ring of non-detection or some other non-detection item for covert operations, very few outside of Nazarik were known to employ them. Magical development in the region was, in a word, lopsided. Some nations had very little of it, while those that were considered leaders in arcanistry and divine magic focused on certain fields while ignoring others. Divination and counter-divination were mostly ignored. Pandora's actor speculated it was that way because there were both mundane and magical means to foil it, making it unprofitable for magic casters to focus their resources on. This made things rather convenient for Nazarik, as the poor state of those fields created all sorts of openings for their intelligence operatives to exploit. Non-detection wasn't completely unknown in the region, however. Assassins, for instance, were masters of disguise, and non-detection was one of the techniques that they used to defend against any attempts to foil their mystical subterfuge. That was if they developed it, of course. Most of the assassins in Ijarnia had it. There was also the fact that there were many unknown job classes in the New World, and there were many things that shouldn't have been. I will see what I can do. Is there someone available to lead me to the location? We will have them rendezvous with you, say Boss Summer. What if the individuals who defeated Captain Zaradnik are still present? Capture them for interrogation, if possible. Destroy them if not. Understood. Queen Aurigulus would like an update on the Royal Army's progress. Thanks to Sebos Summer breaking their counteroffensive, our forces are cleaning up the remaining enemy elements in the vicinity of the hill. Our offensive on the northern front is proceeding nominally, and Sub-Commander Olga is working to restore the encirclement. I see. Thank you. Sebos lowered his hand. Queen Aurigulus looked up at him expectantly. It appears that I have an errand to attend to, Sebos said. Let us return to the battlefield.